So let's look at the anterior pituitary. Posterior pituitary was neural tissue, modified neural tissue. The anterior pituitary is modified epithelial tissue. The posterior pituitary consists essentially of axonal projections. Right? The cell bodies are in the hypothalamus. It's the axons of the paraventricular and supraosmotic that move through the posterior pituitary. In lab, you're going to look histologically at it, and it's going to look very homogeneous with relatively small amounts of blue or purple dots. Why? Blue and purple dots are the nuclei, and there are relatively few cell bodies in the posterior pituitary. That's not true of the anterior pituitary. Anterior pituitary is right here. So you have all these different cell types. Well, these cells are influenced by hypothalamic cells as well, but instead of having axonal projections down, the hypothalamic cells have relatively short axons. These cells produce a neurohormone that is dumped into the capillary supply, which then is transported by a portal system down to have its effect on the anterior pituitary cells. Well, this is a relatively short distance to travel. The hormone doesn't have to circulate throughout the entire body to get to these cells. As a consequence, the concentrations of hypothalamic hormones are relatively small. Our ability to measure those hormones was severely limited early on in the discovery period. So we knew a lot more about anterior pituitary hormones than we did about the hypothalamic hormones that influence them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with the anterior pituitary hormones, talk about their function, and then come back and tell you a bit about the hypothalamic hormones. So if we move about halfway down the page, you'll see this nice little diagram that talks about, or discussion that talks about the anterior pituitary, the hormone which is produced by those cells, the cell type, and its stain reaction. It's not important to me that you know the specific cell type or the stain reaction. I want you to focus on the hormones that are produced by those cells. But recognize that because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different hormones being produced by anterior pituitary cells, those cell bodies look a little different. They were described histologically different because of their staining. That is, some liked basic stain. They were basophilic, that's dark purpling. Some didn't stain as purple, it was pale. Some were acidophilic, so they tended to stain red. The consequence is that if you look at these histologically, it's a very chromic, it's a chromophilia, it's a very colorful kind of cell population. And you recognize that. Compare posterior pituitary, it's like all pink. No cell bodies. You look at the anterior pituitary, and it's like all this color looks like a modern abstract art because of all the color. Well, that's reflective of the staining. The staining is reflective of the different cell types, and the cell types are given these names like a thyrotrope or a corticotrope. What's important about that is these cells are producing hormones which are tropic or trophic, that is, supportive. So whenever you see the word tropic or trophic, it means supporting. So a thyrotrope cell is important in the support of the thyroid gland. Corticotrope, a hormone that is important in supporting the adrenal cortical cells. Gonadotropes are going to support the gonads, ovaries, and testes. A somatotrope is going to be something which supports the cell body, its growth. A mammotrope is a compound that supports mammary gland function. So let's look at each of these hormones. Thyroid stimulating hormone. We talked about the thyroid as being an endocrine organ. A trophic cell for the thyroid gland, it comes from the anterior pituitary cells, a thyroid-stimulating hormone. Corticotrope, the hormone that is produced in the anterior pituitary, is ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. So it's supporting the adrenal. FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, are two hormones that are important in support and production of the gonads. And we'll talk about those in detail in the reproductive section. Growth hormone. A lot of cells responsive to growth hormone. That is, so growth hormone is produced in the anterior pituitary. Prolactin. Lactation, meaning milk. We've already talked about oxytocin. Oxytocin is a hormone that is involved in what is called milk letdown. You need to have the milk produced in order for oxytocin to work. They are distinct hormones. Great test question. Prolactin is important in milk production. Oxytocin is critical in the delivery of that produced milk. The anterior pituitary cells, these anterior pituitary cells, are under the influence of releasing and inhibitory proteins from the hypophysis or hypothalamus. So there's the hypothalamic hormones, there's the anterior pituitary hormones. These are all protein hormones. So the mechanism of action, extracellular receptors, very fast, very responsive. Let's go down to the bottom of the page and give you kind of the example. So here's this is the level of the anterior pituitary. So these are all anterior pituitary cells. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone, that's coming from the thyrotrope cells. It has as its target tissue thyroid gland. The thyroid gland produces thyroxin, T4. So we've kind of heard about that. We'll come back and talk in detail about the thyroid gland. But recognize that hormone is under the influence of TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. Well, thyroid-stimulating hormone is under the influence of a protein hormone released from the hypothalamus called thyroid-releasing hormone. So this is several levels, and these arrows are meant to indicate negative feedback. So excessive secretion of T4 inhibits TSH, inhibits TRH. So it's as T4 rises, levels of TRH and TSH drop. They drop, T4 drops. As T4 drops, you now have less negative inhibition. That makes sense? Follow? Less negative inhibition. So TRH and TSH go up. So this is, we see what we call pulsatile or rhythmic fluctuations in these protein hormones. And it turns out that the magnitude of the changes and the frequencies of these changes are what kind of sets the physiological response. So that's thyroid. Anterior pituitary hormone that produces adrenocorticotropic hormone. Adrenocorticotropic hormone has as its target tissue the adrenal cortex and stimulates the release of cortisol. So this hormone is under the release of ACTH. ACTH is under the influence of a protein hormone from the hypothalamus called corticotropic releasing hormone, or corticotrope, CRH. FSH, LH. They have as their target tissues testes in the male. That hormone is testosterone. Hormones in the ovary, progesterone and estrogen. These compounds are under, FSH and LH are under the control of a protein hormone released from the hypothalamus called GnRH, gonadotrophic releasing hormone. Cell bodies in the anterior pituitary also produce growth hormone. Growth hormone has as its target tissue many, many tissues, some including the liver, which produces a number of proteins which are important in mediating growth, so those are given the name of somatomedins. In addition, many, many tissues, bone, muscle, brain tissue, all have and are in need of growth hormone. Growth hormone is under the control, in fact, of two different types of hypothalamic hormones. One which causes the release, so there's growth hormone releasing hormone and growth hormone inhibitory hormone. A inhibitory hormone that helps prevent growth is also referred to as a somatostatin. It produces a static growth. So inhibitory GIH is also somatostatin. The final cell population, can you take me out of the picture for a minute? The final hormone that is produced by the anterior pituitary is prolactin. Prolactin is a protein hormone which has as its target tissue the mammary gland. Like oxytocin, it's involved in milk. The distinction is oxytocin causes contraction of the smooth muscle and the ejection of milk, but in order for that milk to be produced, you need to have this hormone, prolactin. So prolactin, milk production; oxytocin, milk ejection or letdown. Prolactin is under the control of two hormones, one which is prolactin releasing hormone and prolactin inhibitory. So the balance of these two hypothalamic hormones will determine the magnitude of prolactin release. Okay. So let's give an example. We'll kind of go through each of these organ systems and look at them one at a time. So if you turn to plate 118, we will talk about, if we can find it, growth hormone, growth and metabolic effects. Interesting. Give me a second. Plate 117, no plate 118. That's odd. All right, so we're going to have to go to the overhead. Can we do that for this? So I don't have it on my computer. I don't know why I didn't scan that, but we're going to start on plate 118 then and talk about growth hormone effects. So here is the here's your schematic diagram of the hypothalamus. Yeah, I could probably just use this then. Hypothalamus stimulating the release of growth hormone from the anterior pituitary cells, and then the effect of growth hormone. So growth hormone, important in growth. It stimulates all kinds of tissues, skeletal muscle, visceral tissues, but not that of the brain and gonads, interestingly. The effects of GH are principally after birth. So we see its actions on growth of the neonate. You get into problems then with inadequate growth hormone production only after birth. If there's an excessive amount of growth hormone secretion, you get gigantism, too much growth. Inadequate amounts of GH produce a dwarfism. How is this manifested? Well, in part by the influence of growth hormone on bone, skeletal growth. So if we look at these cells right here, the growing cells of the bone are called physeal plates. The areas around the physeal plates are called the epiphyseal plates. So you'll note here in your notes it refers to as the epiphyseal plates. These are the growth plates of the bone, and they cause the bone to grow in this direction and this direction. In addition, you have growth, cell proliferation that goes out in this direction and out in this direction. So under the influence of growth hormone, skeletal bones get longer and they get thicker. Consequently, unregulated GH produces excessively long and thick bones. The first manifestation of this is a very large individual, hence the term gigantism. As these individuals grow, the growth plates eventually shut down, but the growth continues in thickness, and this produces what's called acromegaly. In addition to cell proliferation in the bone, there is cell proliferation in visceral tissues. There's also increased protein synthesis by cells. So this is necessary for building. Growth hormone, necessary energy for building. So not only you're making proteins, but you're mobilizing fats for energy. GH is required for normal muscular activity and exercise. So decreases in growth hormone lead to decreased protein production, decreased fat production, and can be represented then by individuals who are exercise intolerant. They don't have the capacity. So we see growth hormone not just in growth, not only in growing from a neonate to an adult, but also the maintenance throughout life. And growth hormone works in concert with thyroid hormone to maintain a normal metabolic rate. We'll talk about thyroid hormone in a bit, but your metabolism, your energy metabolism, is under the control of these different hormones. What's interesting is that in starvation, right, you're kind of in an energy deficient system. But in fact, we see elevations of growth hormone because the stimulus is, I don't have enough fats. Which is why you see up here, one of the stimuluses for the release of growth hormone is are free fatty acids and glucose. So your hypothalamus is sensing glucose levels, free fatty acid levels. It's kind of sensing the energy status of the individual. In starvation, you're not getting adequate nutrient, but you still need to provide that energy for all of your other cells. Hence, increased GH in starvation. Now, interesting, metabolic rate goes down when you starve. That has a lot to do with thyroid hormone. So again, growth hormone works in concert with thyroid hormone. The control of growth hormone, it's under the control both of a stimulatory hormone and an inhibitory protein. Growth hormone, inhibitory hormone. The episodic or pulsatile occurrence of GH is very telling. We talked about how do these hormones aren't on constantly, particularly with this negative feedback. Release of growth hormone causes an inhibition of growth hormone releasing hormone. As a consequence, you'll see increases in growth hormone followed by decreases in hormone, but in this case, there's a modulation due to the daily cycle. And it's the magnitude of these changes that influence. So let's turn to plate 119, which I did manage to copy, and talk about thyroid hormone. So if you palpate in us right about here, you're going to feel the thyroid gland. In cats, it tends to be into the thorax. So if you can palpate the thyroid of a cat, it's abnormal. The different anatomical relation, well, that's not plate 119, is it? There we go. The anatomical relationship of the different glands varies from species to species. In some cases, they're two paired separate glands. In humans, they are connected by an isthmus or connecting tissue, but the function is similar. The primary effect of thyroid hormone is on metabolism. So here's kind of the overview. Can you take me out of the picture for just a second? This is the thyroid gland. So here's the thyroid gland. It's located in the neck. Thyroid hormone has as its target tissue many cells, represented here: muscle, bone, heart, and brain. Right, so where growth hormone tended not to have a huge influence on neural tissue, that's not the case with thyroid hormone. Thyroid is important in increasing the metabolism or the energetics of these different tissues. So if you have lots of thyroid hormone, muscular activity is increased, cardiovascular activity is, and your brain neural tissue is working more, also more protein synthesis. Thyroid hormone is under the control of TSH. TSH, remember, is a hormone in the anterior pituitary. That hormone is under the control of thyrotropin-releasing hormone, TRH, from the hypothalamus. So, the ultimate stimulus for the release of thyroid hormone has to do with input stress. Cold, heat is inhibitory, and emotions can affect your response. Cold environment, what do you want to do? You want to increase metabolism. So a cold stimulus, your perception of a cold environment in the hypothalamus produces release of TRH, which stimulates the release of TSH, which stimulates the release of the thyroid hormone. Thyroid hormone has a negative feedback on the anterior pituitary. There is also a presumed feedback onto the hypothalamus. And again, helping to regulate that. So let's look at this hormone in a little more detail. You can bring me back now into the picture. So the hypothalamus, a releasing hormone, TRH, the anterior pituitary cell, the thyrotrope cells that are producing TSH, or thyroid stimulating hormone. Now let's talk about the thyroid gland. I've already introduced you to T4. You need to know that the other name for T4 is thyroxine. So those are synonyms. T4 is a thyroid hormone. So is T3, or triiodothyronine. So the common ion here is iodine, meaning that you have a dietary requirement for iodine. So we have iron that's tied up in heme synthesis. We now have iodine that is important for the production of thyroid hormone. T4, 4 iodines, T3, 3 iodines attached to these. Let's look at individual cell. So here's my cell. Can you, I'll just move it. Here's the gland, a little section of the gland. You have, in fact, you have follicles, which are essentially a sphere of these thyroid cells. So the sphere then is made up of these cells, these follicles or spheres set within the matrix of the thyroid gland, and they have access then to the circulatory system. Here is a thyroid cell, a couple of cells. There's the nucleus. Here's iodine. And it is ionic in form. So we talk about iodide. So iodide is the ionic form. It in fact gets a hydrogen ion put onto it, so it becomes iodine in here. So the difference between iodide and iodine for this class isn't as important. What you need to know is that this requires a dietary input of iodine. So iodine has to come in the diet. Under the influence of TSH, you have this transport mechanism, which moves iodine in. So without any TSH, this movement doesn't happen. The primary regulator of the function of these cells is TSH. So TSH influences not only iodine uptake, but it also influences the metabolism and production and generation of thyroglobulins. Thyroglobulins are proteins that are important in binding and maintaining iodine and aid in the production of T4 and T3. So TSH is important for iodine transport. It's also required for the production of T3 and T4. TSH is also important in the production of the individual cells. So TSH can increase the number of cells and the size of the cells of the thyroid gland. We can give those terms a hyperplasia. So hyperplasia means an increase in the number of cells. Hypertrophy means an increase in the size. Did I say that? Hyperplasia, increased number. Hypertrophy, increase in size. So under the influence of TSH, the gland can get bigger and bigger. Oh, the other component that we needed in this process was the amino acid tyrosine. So there's your components. You've got to have the amino acid building block tyrosine. You need to have iodine. Thyroglobulin is a modulator of that. So what happens? Let's talk hyperthyroid versus hypothyroid. And we'll start our first example as a hypothyroid individual. When we use the term hypothyroid, that means concentrations of T4 are decreased. Abnormally low levels of thyroid. If this happens in neonates, without the thyroid hormone to stimulate neural development, you end up with individuals that are can be dummy lambs. In humans, the term cretinism is used. Decreased neural mental capacity. We'll talk about the reasons for this. What about in adults? In adults, in animals, in your notes here it says Meigs edema, kind of a thickening of the face. But in fact, what we see in our domestic animals is decreased metabolic rate. These animals have low metabolic rates. They are very lethargic. They tend to be grossly overweight. Their energy just isn't high enough. Contrast that with hyperthyroidism. Hyperthyroidism is an excess in T3 and T4. So you've got lots of T3, you have lots of T4, excess energy, high metabolic rates. These individuals thin. Cat walks in, skinny. How's the cat eating? Eats like a champ and just gets skinnier and skinnier. Palpate, oh, it's big thyroid. Hyperthyroid. We'll continue next time talking about some of the pathology and how we can use diagnostics to tease out whether these animals are truly hyperthyroid, hypothyroid, and why they are. But we'll do that next time.